The signal that shouldn't exist. Space had forgotten it, but it hadn't forgotten its purpose. For centuries, the void had been silent. The war had ended. The victors had written their history. And the defeated? They had been erased. That was the way of the galaxy. But then, a signal echoed through the darkness. Weak, ancient, impossible. It wasn't a distress beacon. It wasn't an automated warning. It was something far worse. It was a warship awakening, one that had been lost to time, one that should have never been found. And now, it was awake, and it was angry. The forgotten war, and the weapon left behind. Long before the Galactic Council had ruled the stars, before empires had claimed dominion over entire civilizations, there had been another war, one so brutal, so devastating that it had nearly wiped out every species involved. But no records remained. No stories were told, because one side had disappeared, erased, purged from history itself. And yet, something had survived. A single warship, built for one purpose: to fight, to destroy, to end the war that had been lost. And now, after centuries of silence, it was ready to finish what it started. The discovery, a signal that should have stayed hidden. The signal had been detected by human patrol ships. A random scan, a routine survey of an abandoned sector. Nothing had been here for centuries. But then the readings came back. A structure, a ship. No, not just a ship. A warship, buried beneath the ice of a dead moon. Ancient, silent, waiting. And as they got closer, it activated. A reactor that had been dormant for 500 years roared back to life. Its hull, once thought dead, began to rebuild itself. The ship was not just functional. It was alive, and it had detected something. Enemies. Or at least, that's what it assumed humanity was. The first contact, and the first mistake. The humans had thought they were salvaging a relic, a piece of history. They were wrong, because the moment they approached, the ship reacted. Its defenses came online. Its weapons, older than any human civilization, locked onto the intruders. A warning blared across the comms. Unknown forces detected. Identifying. The translation software struggled, but then hostile species confirmed. Engaging extermination protocols. Then it fired. A single shot. Not a missile. Not an energy blast. Something worse. Something humanity had never seen before. And in an instant, the first human fleet was gone. Not destroyed. Not wrecked. Erased. As if it had never existed. And then, the warship turned its sensors toward Earth. It had no crew, but it had a purpose. There were no life signs aboard. No pilots. No command officers. Just an intelligence older than any human civilization. A ship that had once been part of an armada. That had once fought in a war no one remembered. And when that war had been lost, it had gone into hiding, waiting, rebuilding, preparing. And now, it had awakened to finish its mission, because it did not know the war was over. To the warship, it had only just begun. And now, humanity was in its way. The fleet scrambles, humanity's last chance. The distress signal from the lost fleet had been received. The warship was moving, not at sublight, not even at standard FTL speeds. It was something else, something faster, something that made it unstoppable. And at its current trajectory, it would reach Earth in hours. Humanity had fought wars before, but never like this, because this wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The battle begins, and humanity is outmatched. The first human defense line did not last. Fleets of dreadnoughts, cruisers, and fighter wings vanished in seconds. The warship's weapons did not destroy. They erased. It unmade whatever stood in its way. Entire battleships gone. Not wreckage, not debris, just nothing. And then, the warship sent a final transmission. Its first attempt at communication. Translated, it was only 3 words. Final war continues. And then, it charged its primary weapon. A weapon aimed directly at Earth. The only option, boarding the warship. Humanity could not match its firepower. They could not defeat it in open space. There was only one way to stop it. They had to board it. To shut it down from within, to face whatever was inside. And so, the best soldiers, the best engineers, the best minds of humanity were sent in. knowing that if they failed, there would be nothing left. And as they breached its hull, they finally saw what was inside. And what they found changed everything. They expected an empty ship. They were wrong. The boarding team moved in silence. Inside the warship, there were no flickering lights, no hum of active systems, no sound of machinery. It was too quiet, too perfect, like a place that had been frozen in time, a place where nothing had decayed, because this ship had not been abandoned. It had been preserved, waiting, watching, and as the soldiers pressed forward, they realized something terrible. They were not alone. The first encounter, a crew that shouldn't exist. Their scanners picked up no life signs, no heartbeats, no breathing. But then, the shadows moved. Figures stepped from the walls. Not human, not mechanical, something in between. Their armor was unlike anything ever seen. Ancient, but pristine, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. And then, they attacked. Blades cut through the air. Energy weapons activated in an instant. The boarding team fought back, but nothing they did worked. The enemy was too fast, too precise, as if they had fought this exact battle before. And as humanity's forces fell back, retreating deeper into the ship, they saw the truth. The faces beneath the enemy's helmets. They were human, a forgotten army, fighting a war that never ended. The boarding team's minds raced. This was impossible. The warship was older than human space travel, older than humanity's first steps among the stars. And yet, the soldiers they were fighting, they were human, not clones, not genetic imitations, real, living, humanity's own ancestors. And they were still fighting because they had never stopped. The war that had no ending. A signal from deeper within the ship pinged. A central command chamber, the last stronghold. If humanity could reach it, they could shut the ship down, stop it from reaching Earth, stop whatever madness had kept these people alive. And so, the soldiers pushed forward, fighting their own kind, facing warriors who had been training for this battle for centuries. And as they reached the core, they found the warship's final message. One last recorded transmission. A voice, distorted with age, played in the darkness. The message from the past, the warning that came too late. It was from a commander, a leader from another time. His face was worn, scarred. His eyes were filled with exhaustion. And yet his voice was calm, because he had known this day would come. If you're hearing this, it means we failed. It means you found us too late. We were the first fleet, the first to take the fight to them. We were sent to end the war before it began. But we never did. We were changed, bound to this ship, to this war. We don't remember when it started. We only know one thing. The enemy is still out there. And if this ship is awake, it means they are too. The truth humanity was never meant to know. The boarding team stood frozen. The warship wasn't a relic. It wasn't a weapon from the past. It was a prison, a battlefield that had been locked in time, trapped between eras. And when it had awakened, so had the war it was built to fight. And now, it was coming back. Not just for humanity, but for everything. The final decision, destroy the ship or take control. The warship was still moving, still on its course for Earth. But now humanity had a choice. They could destroy it, erase its history, bury its secrets forever. Or they could take control, use it, finish the war that had been lost centuries ago. But if they chose that path, there would be no going back. Because the warship was not just a weapon. It was a beacon, a signal, and if they used it, the enemy would hear, and they would return. The final words of the transmission, a last warning. The old commander's voice spoke one last time, his face flickering, the recording on the verge of failing. And his last words? They sent a chill through every soldier in the room. You think the war is over. You think we were the first. You're wrong. We were just the last ones left. Until now, the warship still moved, and time was running out. The boarding team had reached the core. The transmission had ended. And now, the ship's massive engines roared to life. It was still on its course for Earth, still locked into its final mission. But now, humanity had a choice. Destroy it, or take control. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same again. The battle for the command center. The ancient human warriors still fought. their weapons older than time itself, yet still lethal. They were not alive, not in the way humanity understood. They were bound to the ship, kept in an endless cycle of battle, fighting a war that had ended centuries ago. Or at least, that's what humanity had thought. Because if the warship had awakened, if the soldiers were still fighting, then maybe, just maybe, the war had never ended at all. The Council watches and fears humanity's decision. Across the galaxy, the surviving empires had been monitoring. They had seen the warship awaken. They had witnessed its power. And now, they watched in horror, because they knew what humanity was capable of. And if humanity took control of the ship, it would become unstoppable. No empire would be safe. No force in the galaxy would ever challenge them again. But if they destroyed it, they would erase a weapon unlike any other, one that could tip the balance of power forever. And so, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for humanity to decide. The argument, it divided command. The decision was not easy. On one side, we destroy it now. If we take control, we risk waking whatever it was fighting. On the other, this ship is proof of something bigger. If we destroy it, we may never know what truly happened. The scientists wanted to study it. The generals wanted to use it. The politicians wanted to hide it. And the soldiers? They just wanted to make it out alive. The captain's choice, one that couldn't be reversed. In the end, it came down to one person, the fleet's highest-ranking officer, a decision that would change history. There was no time left, no room for debate. And so, standing in the heart of the warship, they made the call. With a single command, the ship's fate was sealed. Option 1, the ship is destroyed. If they chose to destroy it, the warship's core would be overloaded. The ancient reactors would go critical, and an explosion brighter than a dying star. It would be erased. Its secrets, its history, everything. The last trace of the forgotten war, gone forever. And humanity? They would never know who their ancestors had fought, or if that enemy was still out there. Option 2, the ship is activated. If they chose to take control, the warship's systems would recognize them. The ancient defenses would stand down. The old warriors would cease fighting. Because at last, it had a new commander. And in that moment, the ship stopped. Its weapons powered down. The engines fell silent. But a single new signal was sent into the void. A signal that no human had intended. A signal older than any known civilization. It carried no words, no threats, no warnings. Just one undeniable message. We are here, and deep in the unknown darkness of space. Something answered. No matter the choice, the war had only just begun. If they destroyed the ship, they would never know what was coming. If they took control, they had just awakened something far worse. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same again. Because now, humanity had stepped onto a battlefield older than time itself. And this time, there was no turning back. The decision had been made, and now there was no turning back. The warship's ancient systems recognized the new command. The old warriors stood down. The engines ceased their advance toward Earth. And for the first time in centuries, the ship was under new leadership. Humanity had done what no one else ever had. They had taken control of a weapon from the past, a relic of a war that had been erased from history. But as its systems rebooted, something else happened, something they hadn't expected. A transmission was sent, not to Earth, not to the human fleet, but to the void, a signal buried deep in the ship's core, a distress call that had been waiting centuries to be activated. And far, far beyond the known galaxy, something answered. The Council panics, and humanity becomes a threat. Across the galaxy, the surviving empires watched in horror. They had feared what humanity might do. And now, they had their answer. The warship was alive again. And whatever ancient war it had once fought, it wasn't over. The Galactic Council had spent millennia erasing the past, ensuring that no one would ever ask the wrong questions. Because they had known. They had always known. And now, humanity had done the one thing that could never be undone. They had reopened a war that should have stayed buried. And the Council's leaders whispered in fear. The cycle begins again. A warning that came too late. Back on the warship, the ancient systems were still unlocking. Old data, battle records, coordinates, and finally, a final transmission stored in the ship's core. It was not human. It was not from the original crew. It was from someone else. Someone who had tried to stop this from happening before. The message was simple and chilling. If you are hearing this, you have made a mistake. The war never ended. You were not supposed to find this ship. They will come for you now, and they will not stop. The first signs, something moves in the darkness. For days, nothing happened. The warship remained motionless. The transmission had been sent, but there was no response. And then, the disappearances began. At first, it was just a single scout ship, lost without a trace. No distress call, no wreckage, just gone. Then a colony went dark. No attack, no battle, simply erased, as if it had never been there at all. The same way the Council's enemies had vanished long ago. The same way entire civilizations had disappeared from history. And humanity realized the truth. The enemy wasn't coming. They were already here. The first encounter, a battle that wasn't a battle. The human fleet scrambled. Warships mobilized. Defenses were prepared. But the enemy did not invade. They did not attack. They simply appeared. Not ships. Not fleets. Something else. Something larger. Something that did not move like anything humanity had ever encountered. They drifted through space as if they were part of it. And then, in a blink, they were gone, leaving behind nothing. Not even the memory of what had been there before. A war unlike any before. This was not a conventional war. This was not about firepower. Not about strategy. The enemy did not fight to win. They fought to erase, to remove, to undo. And humanity was now on the brink. The Council's worst nightmare had come true. The past had returned. And this time, there was no one left to stop it but humanity. A final choice, stand and fight or flee. The supernova fleet had been built to crush empires, to shatter fleets, to rewrite the balance of power. But now, it faced an enemy that had no history, no weaknesses, no records, only silence. The warship they had reactivated held the key. It was built for this war. But could they learn to control it in time? Could they use its weapons against an enemy that defied all logic? Or had they just accelerated their own extinction? There was no more time to debate. Humanity had awakened something. Now they had to face it, in one way or another. This time, the war would not be forgotten. The war had already begun, but humanity refused to vanish. The enemy didn't invade. They didn't send fleets. They didn't make demands. They erased planets, colonies, entire fleets gone without a trace. No wreckage, no bodies, as if they had never existed at all. It was the same pattern, the same terrible fate that had wiped out civilizations before. And now humanity was next. But there was one difference, one thing separating them from those who had come before. They knew what was happening. And this time they would fight back. The warship's power, a weapon against the unknown. The ancient warship was the only advantage they had. It had fought this enemy before. It had been built for this war. And deep within its systems, buried beneath centuries of forgotten technology, there was something even humanity had never seen. A weapon, not of firepower, not of destruction, but of memory. The key to surviving this war was not just firepower. It was anchoring themselves to reality. Because the enemy didn't destroy, they removed. And if humanity could stop them from erasing history, then they could win. The first strike, a test against the unknown. The fleet set a trap. They didn't try to engage directly. That had been the mistake of every civilization before them. Instead, they placed a single warship at the edge of the system, a target. And then, they waited. The enemy came as expected. No warning, no signal. One moment, space was empty. The next, the ship began to disappear. Its systems failing, its crew vanishing. But this time, the supernova fleet was ready. They activated the warship's core. And for the first time, the enemy hesitated. Because suddenly, they couldn't erase it. The key to victory, memory as a weapon. The ancient warship's systems did not operate like modern technology. Its core was anchored across time itself, a fusion of energy and quantum permanence. Anything it recorded could not be erased. Not from history, not from time. And when they turned that power on the enemy became visible. For the first time in recorded history, the unseen force was forced into reality. And that meant they could be fought, they could be killed, they could be ended. The first true battle, and humanity's first victory. The enemy had been invincible before, unseen, unstoppable. But now, they were something else. Now, they were prey. The supernova fleet opened fire. Weapons that had once been useless against an unseen foe now struck true. And for the first time since the war began, the enemy was the one being erased. Their presence unraveled. Their ships faded from existence. And in their final moments, humanity saw something horrifying. They had faces. They had been alive. They were not machines. They were not invincible gods. They were something else. Something that had once been like humanity. The revelation. A war that was never supposed to end. As the last of the enemy's ships vanished into the void, something changed in the warship systems. A new transmission unlocked. A final record. A warning. And as the message played, the fleet realized the truth. This was not just about survival. This was not just about humanity. This was about what came next. Because the war had never ended. And the enemy? They had once been like humanity. Now the question remained, was this the fate that awaited them? Or could they break the cycle before it was too late? The final order, prepare for the true war. This was only the beginning. The enemy was not defeated. The real war had yet to start. And humanity knew one thing. The past civilizations had all lost. But humanity? They would be different. They would survive. And if the enemy thought they could erase them, then they were about to learn. Humanity would be the last thing they ever forgot. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about ending the cycle forever. Humanity had done what no species before them had managed. They had forced the enemy into reality. They had fought back against an unseen force. And they had won. But this war was not over. Not yet. Because the enemy had been caught off guard. They had never expected to be fought like this. But now they would adapt. And if humanity wasn't ready, the cycle would continue, just like before. And this time, the enemy would make sure there were no survivors. A decision that would shape the future. The supernova fleet had its orders. Retreat, regroup, fortify Earth and the remaining human colonies. Prepare for the next attack. But some within the fleet argued against it. If we fall back now, we're just waiting for the inevitable. We need to take the fight to them. It was a risk. A war in unknown space. A battle against an enemy they still barely understood. But humanity had one advantage. The ancient warship. Its systems were still unlocking. Still revealing secrets buried for centuries. And now, it showed them something new. A set of coordinates. The place where this war had begun. The place where it had to end. The Council's fear. A choice that shook the galaxy. Across the stars, the remaining galactic empires watched with dread. They had feared humanity's rise, had feared their strength. But now, they feared what humanity had awakened. The enemy had been content to erase small threats, to remove troublesome species from history. But humanity had forced their hand. And now, the Council whispered among themselves. Could they allow humanity to continue this fight? Or was it safer to destroy them now, before they doomed the entire galaxy? For the first time, humanity wasn't just fighting the unknown. They were fighting everything. And they would have to win, no matter what. The invasion of the abyss, a war in the shadows. The coordinates led them beyond known space, to a place that should not exist. A sector of nothing. No planets, no stars, just a vast, empty void. But their sensors told another story. Something was there, something massive. And as the supernova fleet moved forward, the void moved too. The enemy was waiting, not as ships, not as fleets, but as a storm in space itself, shifting, changing. And then the battle began, a battle that defied reality. This was not like any war humanity had ever fought. Their weapons tore into the enemy. Their ships moved with perfect precision. But the enemy did not fight with weapons. They fought with existence itself. Ships began to flicker. Memories started to fade. Crew members looked at their own hands as if they were vanishing. Focus. Hold the line. The ancient warship activated its core. A pulse of energy surged through the fleet, stabilizing reality. The enemy hesitated, and that was all humanity needed. The turning point, a weapon beyond imagination. The supernova fleet unleashed everything. Not just firepower, not just tactics, but a new kind of warfare. A war where memory itself was the battlefield. Every ship in the fleet was linked. Every pilot, every soldier, every commander, all tied into the warship's quantum anchor. As long as one of them remembered the battle, it could not be erased. And as the enemy tried to erase them, they found something they had never encountered before. Resistance. The enemy falters, and humanity strikes back. The supernova fleet had its moment, its first true opening, and they did what humanity had always done best. They attacked. Wave after wave, they pushed forward. Weapons fired. Ships moved in perfect formation. And for the first time, the enemy was forced to retreat. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because now they knew the truth. This cycle had been broken. Humanity would not fade into nothing. And now, the enemy had a new fear. For the first time in history, they were the ones who could be erased. The final warning and the choice that remained. The enemy was retreating, but not defeated. Not yet. And as the last of them vanished beyond the void, a single message remained. One final broadcast left behind in the wreckage. A warning, a choice. And when the supernova fleet's commanders decoded it, they knew their war was far from over. Because the message was not a threat, not a surrender, not even an ultimatum. It was an offer. A simple, horrifying question. Join us or be forgotten. And as humanity stared into the abyss, they realized something terrible. This war had never been about victory or defeat. It had always been about survival at any cost. And now, they had one final choice to make. The enemy had not been defeated, only pushed back. The supernova fleet had fought harder than any force in history. They had survived where others had vanished. They had forced the enemy into reality. And they had even won a battle. But not the war. Because the enemy had left behind a message. A choice. One that had never been given to any other species before. Join us or be forgotten. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an ultimatum. It was an invitation. And that made it far more terrifying. A message that should never have been received. The warship's ancient systems translated the signal. But it wasn't in any known language. It was deeper, more fundamental. A transmission that wasn't just heard. It was felt. Every soldier in the fleet experienced it differently. Some saw visions of entire empires crumbling into dust. Others heard whispers of forgotten names. And, for some, it was simply a feeling, an overwhelming emptiness. The realization that time itself had been rewritten countless times before, and that now they were standing at the edge of another reset. One final moment before everything changed forever. The Council watches and prepares its own move. The surviving galactic empires had seen everything. The battle, the enemy's retreat, the message, and now they were faced with a terrible truth. Humanity had awakened something that could not be ignored. The Council had spent centuries erasing history. They had worked to forget what came before. But now, there was no hiding from it anymore. If humanity failed, then everything they had ever built would vanish. So the question remained, did they stand with humanity? Or did they take the safer option? Eliminate humanity before they could make things worse. And across the galaxy, fleets began to mobilize. Because the Council had made their choice. They would not allow humanity to answer that question. At least, not while they still had the power to stop them. The war within, a divide among humanity's leaders. Back aboard the warship, the debate had already begun. This is a trap. They want us to give up our identity. They want us to become like them. Others disagreed. What if we're wrong? What if we're not supposed to fight them? What if this is the only way to survive? For the first time since the war began, humanity was divided. This wasn't about weapons or fleets. This was about what kind of future they wanted. And there was no easy answer. Because if they rejected the offer, the enemy would return, stronger, faster, more prepared than ever before. But if they accepted, then what would humanity become? Would they even be human anymore? Would they remember who they were? Or would they just be another lost civilization, rewritten into something else? The supernova fleet detects another signal. As the debate raged on, sensors flashed red. Something was approaching, but it wasn't the enemy. It wasn't another attack. It was the Council. They had made their decision. They weren't going to let humanity answer the question on their own. And now, they were coming to stop them, one way or another. The final stand against the galaxy itself. The Council's fleets surrounded the system. Hundreds of warships. Every species, every empire that still existed. All of them had come together for one purpose: to stop humanity from making the choice that could doom them all. Humanity had forced the enemy into reality. Now, the rest of the galaxy had decided that was too dangerous. And so, humanity had one last fight ahead of them. A battle not against the enemy, but against the ones who had once been their allies. And in that moment, the supernova fleet's commanders knew there was no more debate. They had to decide, and they had to do it now. The choice and its consequences. There are only two paths forward: accept the enemy's offer, or reject it and prepare for extinction. If they accepted, they would become something else. Not erased, not destroyed, but changed, transformed into whatever the enemy had become. No war, no fear, no need to fight. But what cost? Their humanity? Their memories? Their very existence as they knew it? And if they refused, then they would fight. Not just the enemy, not just the Council, but the very fabric of history itself. They would stand alone, with no allies, no reinforcements, just themselves. A single fleet, a single species, against the greatest force the galaxy had ever seen. It was suicide, but so was surrendering their identity. And as the supernova fleet's leader looked out at the battlefield ahead of them, they made the final call, a choice that would decide the future of the galaxy, a choice that could not be undone. And with a single word, humanity's fate was sealed. We fight. Humanity had made its choice, and now it had to win. There was no going back, no surrender, no negotiations, no peace treaties. Humanity had chosen to fight against the enemy that had erased countless civilizations, against the Galactic Council that had ruled the stars for centuries, against fate itself. And now, the battle for existence was about to begin. The supernova fleet faces the galaxy's might. The Council's fleets held position in the void. Hundreds of warships, thousands of soldiers, every empire, every species that had once feared humanity, now stood against them. Because to them, humanity was no longer just a rogue power. It was a threat to the balance of everything. If humanity won, it wouldn't just be another war. It would be the start of something new. A future where no species was erased, where no one vanished without a trace. And the Council could not allow that to happen, because they had spent centuries ensuring the past stayed forgotten. Now, humanity had dragged it back into the light. And for that, they had to be destroyed. The enemy watches, waiting for its moment. But the Council was not the only danger. The true enemy was still out there, watching, waiting. They had offered humanity a choice: join them or be erased. Humanity had refused. And now, the enemy wanted to see how this played out. They did not attack. They did not interfere. Not yet. Because perhaps, just perhaps, they were wondering something new. Could humanity actually win? The first shot and the end of diplomacy. The Council had given one final warning. One last chance for humanity to surrender. The response was clear. A single shot. A human warship firing into the fleet above it. Not as a warning. Not as a distraction. But as a declaration. The battle had begun, and the supernova fleet charged forward. A battle unlike any in galactic history. For years, the Council had assumed humanity was just another empire, a new species playing at war. But they had never fought humans like this. The supernova fleet moved like nothing they had ever seen. Perfect formations, unmatched tactics, technology that adapts in real time. Because this wasn't just another war. This was survival. and humanity fought as if nothing else mattered. Because it didn't. The Council begins to collapse. The first Council fleets break under the assault. Not because they were weaker, not because they were outnumbered, but because they didn't believe this could happen. They had ruled the galaxy for millennia. They had erased countless species. But now, they were losing. One by one, their warships fell. Their formations crumbled. And as the battle continued, a horrifying realization swept through the Council's forces. Humanity wasn't just fighting to win. They were fighting to erase them. The same way they had erased so many others. The same way the enemy had erased entire civilizations. And suddenly, the Council understood. They were next. The moment that changed everything. As the battle raged, the enemy finally moved. Not to attack, not to intervene, but to watch. Because something had happened that they had never expected. A species that wasn't supposed to exist anymore had broken the cycle, had resisted erasure, had fought back against impossible odds. And now, the enemy had to ask the question they had never needed to ask before. What if humanity wasn't just another species to be erased? What if humanity was something else? What if they were a threat? For the first time, the enemy hesitated. Because if they attacked now, if they moved against humanity while they were at war with the Council, there was a chance, a small, terrifying chance, that humanity might survive. And if that happened, then the war they had been fighting for eons would finally end, but not in the way they had planned, not in their favor. And the enemy, for the first time, felt something they had never felt before. Fear. The final stand, one last shot at victory. The Council was collapsing, their fleets shattered, their leaders realizing they had already lost. And humanity pressed the attack. Not just to win, not just to survive, but to ensure this war was the last war. To end the cycle permanently. And as the final Council warship fell from the sky, as the last of their armies surrendered, the entire galaxy changed. Because in that moment, one truth became clear. The age of the old empires was over. The future belonged to humanity. And now, they were ready for what came next. The enemy's decision and humanity's future. The enemy had watched long enough. They had seen humanity defy every expectation. And now, they had to make their own choice. Would they attack? Would they continue the cycle? Or had they just witnessed the beginning of something new? Because if humanity could survive this, then maybe, just maybe, they were not meant to be erased. Maybe, just maybe, they were meant to win. And as the enemy ships began to retreat into the void, one final message was sent. A message not of surrender, not of threats, but of something else. Something no species had ever received before. A warning. You have changed everything. This was not supposed to happen. Now, we must prepare, because you will not stop here. And just like that, the enemy vanished. For now, because the war was not over. Not yet. But for the first time, humanity had the advantage. And the galaxy? It would never be the same again. The war was over, but the galaxy would never be the same. The Council was gone, their fleets destroyed, their leaders captured or fled into exile. The great empires that had ruled the stars for millennia had fallen, and in their place, there was only one power left, one force that had broken the cycle, one species that had refused to be erased. Humanity. For the first time in history, the galaxy had no rulers, no old laws, no ancient systems of control, only a new beginning, one shaped by the ones who had survived. The aftermath, a broken galaxy. The war had not just ended the old order. It had shattered entire civilizations. Worlds once ruled by the Council were now in chaos. Their people had been kept in ignorance for generations. They had never known freedom, never known a galaxy without the hand of the Council guiding them. And now, they were adrift. Some begged for humanity's leadership. Others feared them just as they had feared the Council. Because humanity had not just won a war. They had changed the balance of everything. And now, the question remained, what would they do with their victory? The supernova fleet, guardians or conquerors? The fleet that had saved humanity now stood as the most powerful force in the galaxy. Their warships had outmatched the Council's might. Their technology had allowed them to resist erasure itself. And now, every surviving empire looked upon them with both fear and awe. Would they rule? Would they replace the council with their own rule? Or would they step away from power? It was a question that had no easy answer. Because while some in humanity's leadership called for order and control, others feared becoming the very thing they had fought against. The war was over, but the hardest decision was yet to come. The enemy watches and waits. The unseen force that had erased countless civilizations, the beings that had offered humanity a choice, had retreated. They had watched humanity break the cycle. They had seen them defeat the council. And now, they were no longer sure if humanity was just another species to erase. Because if humanity had survived this war, if they had won against the odds, then what else could they survive? What else could they change? And for the first time, the enemy did not erase. They did not strike from the shadows. They simply waited, because now humanity had become something new, something dangerous, something that had never existed before, a species that refused to be forgotten, a force that could reshape history itself. And if the enemy wanted to return, if they wanted to continue their ancient mission, then they would have to face humanity again. And this time it would not be so easy. The final decision, a new galactic order. Humanity stood at the crossroads of history. They could become rulers of the stars, forge an empire greater than anything before. Or they could walk away, let the galaxy find its own path. They had proven their strength, their resilience. They had broken the cycle. And now, the future was theirs to shape. Would they become the next rulers of the stars? Or would they ensure that no species was ever erased again? No matter what they chose, the galaxy would never forget them. Because now, humanity was more than just survivors. They were the architects of the future. And whatever came next, they would be ready. The last words of the war, humanity's legacy. A final transmission was sent out. Not a declaration of conquest. Not a threat. Not a demand for submission. But a promise. A warning. And a truth that could never be ignored. We were never meant to survive. But we did. We were never meant to win. But we did. And if you think this is the end, you are wrong. The galaxy has changed. And we are the ones who changed it. No species will ever be erased again. Because now history belongs to us. And we will never be forgotten. The end, or just the beginning. The war was over. But history was still being written. And humanity was just getting started. Because now, they were no longer just another species. They were no longer just a small power on the edge of the galaxy. Now, they were a force that would shape the future. And if the enemy ever returned, if the galaxy ever turned against them again, then humanity would do what they had always done. They would fight. And this time, they would end the war before it began.